much. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me. It's very nice to be here today. But I have to confess, and I hope it won't sound rude, that in fact there are a few things I've come to find more tiresome than what is called the debate on the veil, which is taking up so much time and space in academic debates in particular. And I find it fascinating that we are also fascinated by this debate compared to other discussions we could be having. I mean, I really don't mean to be offensive to the organizers at this point. I think the debate on the veil, as it's called, cannot really be avoided, and I myself have written 2 lengthy articles about headscarves and human rights, which is how I ended up on this panel. But I would really rather actually speak about so many other things that we give much less airtime to. So, for example, the current uprisings in North Africa, none of which seem to promote or provoke quite the same sort of lasting frisson as this particular debate. So I often wonder what the debate on the veil is itself hiding, and I think that's something that we can think about, talk about. I was going to start with a quick note about the terminology that I was going to use referring to specific garments, but the last presenter very helpfully had pictures, so I will spare you that. I will simply note that there has been critique in the academic literature, certainly, of using the term veil to refer to all of these different garments. I will do that somewhat myself just for stylistic reasons, although I note that each of the different garments that you saw the pictures of previously actually may raise very distinct issues. They imply different levels of covering, for example, whether one's face is showing or not. But I do think it's useful to think about these forms of what is called modest dress as part of a spectrum. And I think they do collectively raise a range of similar issues. And I think they're also tied together in another way, which is that the claims for sort of modest dress sometimes escalate up the chain, beginning with one garment which is then deemed insufficiently modest, and then going on to the next. And I'm just reminded of this. I was in Palestine in December doing some academic research and got on the bus in Beit Hanina outside of Jerusalem and saw a big sign at the front of the bus explaining with pictures to women how to wear the hijab and showing that it was not appropriate either to wear the hijab, that is the headscarf, with jeans, as you see many women in fact doing on the streets in Palestine, not even appropriate to wear the headscarf with a long skirt and a long shirt, but the only appropriate way to do so was also wearing the jilbab, a long, usually baggy cloak. So again, this sense of sort of escalation perhaps in claims along this spectrum. But nevertheless, I just did want to point out that these garments are distinct, and one has to be careful of using a general category like the veil, but perhaps it's sort of strategic essentializing that makes having a discussion more useful, easier. Let me say a little bit about my own background. In some ways I hesitate to do this because as a friend recently complained to me, people so often seem to have to want to qualify themselves for participating in the debate. Nevertheless, I think it may be useful for you, especially with my American accent, to have some sense of where my perspective is coming from on these issues. I am the daughter of an Algerian father who came from a devoutly religious Muslim peasant family in the mountains of northeastern Algeria, who became involved in the independence movement against France. After independence, became an anthropologist, did field research on the treatment of Algerian migrant workers in France, and then went back to Algeria to become a professor at the university. So as a result, I spent my childhood in the United States, in France, and in Algeria, so I've looked at these issues across these different contexts. In the 1990s, during the terrible conflict in Algeria between the government backed by the military on the one hand and the forces of armed fundamentalism on the other, my father, like so many other people, received death threats, rather serious death threats from the fundamentalist armed groups, and was ultimately forced to stop teaching, as were so many other Algerian intellectuals. And at this point, I made many trips to Algeria, working with and carrying out research on the efforts of the Algerian women's movement to combat fundamentalist violence against women, which often included attacks on women for choosing not to cover their heads. And I was just back in Algeria this last fall, actually, and visited a social center that has been built dedicated to one of these women who was killed in this manner. She was a law student named Amel Zanoun, who was taken off a public bus when she was coming home from law school and actually had her throat cut in the streets of the city where she lived. And today this Center for Teaching Women Sewing is named for her, and I visited there. And I have to sort of confess my perspective on these issues is, I think, very much shaped by my interaction with and encounter with this particular experience. So you may hear my American accent and think it's a very U.S. perspective. I actually think of my perspective as an Algerian perspective, certainly not the only one. Many Algerians would disagree with me, but many in the Algerian women's movement, I think, would take a similar perspective to the one that I will express on this issue. And in fact, my first recollection of even hearing of the issue of religious extremism or fundamentalism goes back to the early 1980s, when my father came home one night from teaching at the University of Algiers, outraged that a fundamentalist student group had gone into what was then the ordinarily co-ed university cafeteria, remains so today. But they went in and put up a curtain and told all of the men to sit on one side and all of the women to sit on the other side. And one could argue, it might be provocative to do so, but one could argue that for the fundamentalists, veils are similar kinds of curtains. They function in similar ways. Not everyone's understanding, but I would argue that that certainly is the understanding of them put forward by some of the fundamentalist groups that support and push for, quote, modest garments. Thinking about the situation today, I think that what we see is that sort of contradictory developments. In parts of the world, there's an onward march to cover women's bodies, and elsewhere to uncover them, with all of this justified often in the name of women's alleged choices to be covered or uncovered. And we can talk about, I will come back to this whole choice debate later on, choice which has become sort of the excuse du jour for virtually anything. So I think we can't avoid discussing it, confronting it. I've spent the last months, as I mentioned, doing academic research on opposition to fundamentalism in many different Muslim majority contexts, as well as in some Muslim minority populations in Africa, in Asia, and in both Eastern and Western Europe. And what I found interesting was that in each and every single context that I visited, I was told of increasing pressure in recent years on women to cover more and more of themselves. And I was told time and again that the source of this pressure, the initial source of this pressure, was really coming from fundamentalist groups, that is, right-wing groups using their version of Islam as a political agenda. I was told this by Algerians, by Nigerians, by Pakistanis, by Chechens, by Tajiks, by Dagestanians, by Palestinians. So it is, I can't claim that it's universal, but it is a very widespread dynamic. And what we call the debate on the veil, I think, has to be understood in the context of that dynamic, as well as some of the other dynamics that people have mentioned, and the issue of racism that was discussed on the earlier panel.